The Chinese people will never allow any foreign forces to bully, oppress, or enslave them. Anyone trying to do so will most certainly face bloodshed in front of a great wall of steel built by more than 1.4 billion Chinese.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. That was Chinese leader Xi Jinping leading China's celebrations of 100 years of communist rule. And make no mistake, his comments were listened to globally by countries that view China with concern and in some cases fear. The growth of China has been phenomenal, we all know that. But more recently, the growth has been more than just economic, but also the firepower of its military is raising fears of confrontation with America over issues like Taiwan's independence. And Xi warned other nations against trying to bully China. On this backstory, where is China heading? And what should we worry about? Joining me now from London is Steve Tsang. He is a professor of Chinese studies and the director at the SOAS China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Hi, Professor.
Hi.
Look, what a week. 100 years of communism, a huge parade, choreographed television pictures. But some say that the Communist Party maybe isn't as strong in China as it likes to appear to be.
Well, I think it is both. It is both very, very strong and powerful, and at the same time aware of its own vulnerability, which is why Xi Jinping is so focused on internal security and in making sure the party functions very effectively as a Leninist instrument and engaging with the general public to make sure that they all have a reason to rally around the party as good patriotic Chinese citizens are supposed to do.
What does the Chinese Communist Party fear?
Well, the Communist Party of China fears, first and foremost, its own people, because they are the only people who can actually bring it down. They fear internal division, because it is only with a division within the Communist Party that they seriously put their capacities to govern at risk. They are a bit concerned about the outside world, from their perspective, led by the United States, attempting some kind of a conspiracy, which they call either a peaceful evolution or more recently, color revolutions.
Color revolutions like the ones that took place in Georgia and Ukraine, that kind of color revolution?
That's exactly why they were concerned about. And they thought that the Americans and others may well be intending that the ultimate color revolution would be in China itself. And therefore, they really don't want that to even raise its head in China. And it is also why everywhere in the world where there are the equivalent of a color revolution, you would have the Arab Spring, for example, a decade ago coming up, they were pretty quick to respond to that, to make sure that they were contained and couldn't spread.
Let's talk about the threat from within, if there is one. Some people have written that China, in terms of economic growth, has stalled in a way, that you've seen, this tremendous growth, especially in the last 50 years. But in terms of different classes within China, some of them have kind of hit the glass ceiling, as were. And that presents, the economic problem presents more of a threat to China than anything.
Well, the economy always matter. I think the slowing down of growth is a process that happens in all countries going through that stage of economic takeoff. I think once you move from a fast-growing developing economy into a developed economy, you always slow down in terms of the growth. So I don't think that is something inherently that cannot be managed with a slowing down of growth. But in the case of China, I think there are three main challenges that are particular to China. One is the middle income trap. Now, this is not, in a sense, all that completely specific to China, because countries moving into the middle income category will have to break through the middle income group to become the middle income trap to become a high income country.
Yes.
Historically, since the end of the Second World War, all the countries that have successfully done so were democracies, and also were countries that have a high percentage of their population graduated from high school. Now, China is neither. It doesn't mean that China cannot be the super miracle and get that done, but that is a extraordinary achievement that China will have to deliver. The second challenge is the shift from China benefiting from a demographic bonus to a demographic deficit, which certainly will be happening.
Is this the aging population problem?
Which is the aging population and the shrinking population. So you have a increasing aging population being supported by a shrinking working population. And that is going to require a complete economic transformation for China to sustain its growth and to achieve productivity. Now, the third issue is that the economic miracle of the PRC in the last 40 plus years was contributed partly by the stability in China, partly by the entrepreneurial spirit of the Chinese people, but also very significantly by the enormous contributions and investments from the outside world. In the 1980s, it was Hong Kong that was the economic locomotive pulling the Chinese economy along in the period of the reopening and reform. In the 1990s was the transfer of Taiwan's globally well-networked economy and manufacturing capacity and the global supply chain from Taiwan to China. And it was with Hong Kong and Taiwan's help that China was able to attract enormous amount of investments from the West, North America and Europe. And those investments and the readiness to transfer technology to China hugely helped that economic miracle in China.
Right. And now you start mixing in some of the adversarial fear from some of the Western countries that up until now saw China as this great pool of cheap manufacturing and a workforce that was very affordable. And if they're pulled back from China, then what happens?
I think that is exactly the point. I don't think we're going to see a full economic decoupling between China and the external economies, but a limited version of decoupling is almost certainly going to happen. The question is how fast and how far that process will go. And with that, for the Chinese economies to continue to maintain a sufficiently high level of growth is a lot more challenging than that economic miracle that was being delivered in the previous 40 years.
Were you surprised by some of the comments by Xi Jinping this week that, China's not going to allow itself to be bullied? Those who try to will face broken heads and bloodshed in front of the Iron Great Wall of 1.4 billion Chinese people. I mean, who is bullying China, and how seriously did you take his remarks?
Well, when we look at Chinese foreign policy, I think we have to bear in mind that first and foremost, it is about domestic politics. I wrote a paper last year called Party-State Realism, which underlines the importance that when we try to understand Chinese foreign policy, we have to understand that first and foremost, the calculation of national interest is the interest of the party. And this is exactly what it was happening. Xi Jinping was not addressing the international community. He was addressing the domestic audience. If the international community generally reacted negatively to his very aggressive tone, the domestic audience applauded. They thought, yes, this is the man who makes China strong. This is the man who makes China powerful. This is the man who tells the foreigners straight. And that is exactly what Xi Jinping wanted to project. To him, for the 100th year anniversary of the Communist Party, he was going to project that Mao was the man who made China stood up. Xi Jinping is the man that made China strong, powerful, and proud. And he will take China to the next stage. He's not a man looking backward, he's looking forward.
Does that mean he'll take Taiwan?
Yes, I think he will take Taiwan. The question is when and how, and whether he will be allowed to do so.
That's a pretty bold prediction. And you seem very certain. And that's a major disaster in the South China Sea.
Well, I certainly hope that it does not happen in reality.
But you believe it might?
Well, in terms of his ambition, is very, very clear. He wants to create a single, strong, united, and powerful China, having defined Taiwan as Chinese territory.
But there's a risk in doing that, because if there's a war there, wars don't always go according to plan, do they?
Oh, wars do not always go to plan. And in fact, I would go even further to say that even if you are not wanting a war, but if you take actions that can unwittingly escalate into a war, the risk of that unwitting escalation is very real, and we need to take that very, very seriously. But at the moment, you have a political environment and policy-making situations in which nobody within the upper echelon of the Communist Party can tell Xi Jinping that, with the greatest respect, sir, you can't do this.
Has he changed, or are we just really seeing more and more of who Xi Jinping really is?
I don't think Xi Jinping has changed really. And I think we have already seen a huge amount of what he really is by the 19th Party Congress in 2017. He already outlined what his bold vision for China would be. That basically by 2035, China would be very strong, very rich, quite powerful. But by 2049, 2050, after the centenary of the founding of the PRC, the image he was projecting for China would be that China would be second to none. And you can't really expect such a vision to be achieved without China, from its perspective, be covering the most important lost territory. And that happens to be Taiwan.
Will you just talk to me very quickly in closing about the West and how you feel that the West is engaging China now? There are certainly governments that are distancing themselves from China, and from America to the United Kingdom to NATO countries are talking about China. It's on their agenda at the last summit. Do you think that there is folly in confronting China, in trying to contain China, or do you feel that that is something that the West should be doing?
I think a war with China will be a disaster for the human race. Because if we are looking at a war, we are looking at the United States and China on the opposite side, with allies being drawn into it, potentially with nuclear weapons at risk of being used. So such a scenario, I think, should be preempted at all costs. And now, if that is the starting premise, I think it's important that whatever Washington and other capitals may think about Beijing and Beijing's intentions, they must continue to engage with Beijing. Diplomacy is needed the most when one is dealing with adversaries or potential threats. Diplomacy becomes desirable but dispensable among friends. And the increase in tension is the reason why we must intensify the diplomatic engagement in order to try to get our Chinese friends to understand that pushing in that direction really is not in the interest of anybody, and that the United States and other countries, democratic countries, will in fact respond. I think Xi Jinping is a risk taker, but he is not reckless. When we look at potentially deterring a Chinese military efforts to take Taiwan, we should look beyond the military angle. And that is the only way that we could potentially deter and persuade China not to embark on such a course of action.
Well, I mean, and that takes us probably in closing and wrapping this up, that takes us back to where we started. If the Chinese Communist Party has a threat, it is really from division within. And by confronting, world powers, that creates economic instability and it increases the internal threat. So that is the stick rather than the carrot.
I think that is right. And that is exactly where that more effective deterrence will have to come from. Because if Xi Jinping should start a war over Taiwan, and should he not then succeed in that war, that may well be the end of Xi Jinping as the leader of China. That unity around him would crumble. And in the systems that he has built, the top leader is either the top leader or the top leader is going to be in huge amount of trouble. There is no middle ground for him. And this is what we need to persuade him that this is just a risk not worth taking.
Just a risk not worth taking. Steve Tsang, the director of SOAS, China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Really a privilege to talk to you, and thank you so much.
Pleasure.
All right, Maya Wang is a senior China researcher in the Asia division at Human Rights Watch, and she's written and researched extensively on the use of torture, arbitrary detention, and human rights in China. Hi, Maya.
Hi, Dana.
Thank you for talking to us. Is it concerning to report on human rights in China and your ability to do so?
Well, I think it is fair to say that the Chinese government has always been hostile towards the concept of human rights since it came to power, not before. And that it has persecuted human rights activists, particularly domestic activists, and have barred access of those international investigators, including UN experts, to investigate the human rights abuses that has taken place in China.
Could you go to China 10 years ago or 5 years ago?
I would say that the human rights situation in China has substantially deteriorated since Xi Jinping came to power in 2013. Although, of course, like I said, I think the Chinese government has been very hostile to human rights activism for a long time. But I guess if you say 10 years ago, that would be pre-Xi Jinping, and 10 years ago, I think some people would still feel comfortable doing that.
But you wouldn't go now?
I don't think so. I think that right now, I think with the environment in China, I think there is quite a high probability of detention and imprisonment.
Detention and imprisonment. So how do human rights groups, just not Human Rights Watch, document what's going on. It must be a very large challenge now.
Yes, it is. I think not many people have realized. I think that the environment of human rights in China has moved so far towards kind of the negative direction in the last 10 years or so. So what we do, if you think about some of the work we do around the world as Human Rights Watch or global human rights organizations, actually not many countries are entirely kind of essentially does not allow human rights investigators inside, or that it would pose so much risk to human rights investigators that they're closed off to such investigation. There are only very few, and China is that one of them, along with like countries like North Korea or Iran, at least two US-based groups. And how we do our work includes, for example, we, of course, still talk with people inside the country to the extent that we can. Of course, to the extent we do not harm the people inside. So we also understand that lots of people we cannot talk to. The interesting thing about covering China is also the amount of documentation that the Chinese government actually puts out about its own abuses. And that is why we have done a lot of work on that. We have been able to do a lot of work on Xinjiang, is that Chinese government documents itself describes the existence and the practices of putting Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in political education camps. And the reason for such abuses, which is to indoctrinate them, and the conditions of the abuses are often in official documents as well, along with other kind of unconventional investigation techniques, like the use of satellite imagery, or for example, that we've done reverse engineering a policing app to understand the workings of policing systems.
I know you've written a lot about electronic surveillance for Human Rights Watch, and it's mind-boggling the extent of it in China. And even in 2008, when I was covering the Olympics there for American television, I mean, we did stories on electronic surveillance of people, and it certainly increased dramatically. But would you say right now the biggest human rights concern are the Uyghurs and the imprisonment of over 1 million people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's Xinjiang, where northwest China, where Uyghurs make up, a slight majority, is one of the most repressive parts of China, and it has been for some time. Although I think that's, and we're talking about, like you said, not only the arbitrary detention, but also the arbitrary imprisonment of Uyghurs for essentially not having committed any crimes. We're talking about the imprisonment of 25 years of a person who has gone to Turkey to study, for example. That is, having contact abroad is considered a crime. So this tells you a little bit, and this is a very typical case. And we have people who are held in political education camps, and we also have lots of people being held in prisons. And the overall human rights environment in Xinjiang is particularly poor, with the use of mass surveillance technologies. But these abuses are also symptomatic of the broader deterioration of human rights throughout China. So it's not just Xinjiang. We're talking about Tibet and the deterioration of Hong Kong. Hong Kong. Society in Hong Kong.
You've raised Hong Kong, and let's just talk about it for a minute, because if there was an island of freedom, really, still a democracy, still open debate, still free press, I mean, depressingly, that has evaporated. And even in the last, couple of weeks with the closing of Apple News.
Yes. I think the deterioration of Hong Kong, we just put out a report about that, which describes the environment of the last year since the imposition of the draconian national security law by the Chinese government in last year. And the changes are both comprehensive and at a dizzying speed. Mm-hmm. And the attempt is to completely dismantle a free society. And for those people who have been to Hong Kong or haven't been, Hong Kong is a lot like, London or New York. People are in the streets where they can talk about politics. They've never had to fear. And now even just talking about politics, people have stopped, I think, doing that in public for fear of arrest.
So what price has Xi Jinping paid for any of this?
I think that the world's perception of the Chinese government has changed quite a lot in the last few years because of what's happened in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. However, I think this is I would say it's probably most accurate with regard to the West or developed countries. I think you have seen a recent Pew poll that shows how the perception of China in these in developed countries are very negative because of the human rights abuses. But then I think in developing countries where the Chinese government has poured a lot of resources into its One Belt, One Road initiative, I think the situation is very different. And also where the Chinese government essentially controls or have a strong influence over the local media. So we do have two different kind of segments of the world with very different perceptions of what China is. And to developed world, I think the Chinese government's motto is increasingly being rejected. But I think to developing countries, I think the Chinese government holds some strong appeal, especially to the leaders who wish.
Well, money and investment is appealing to governments that are thirsty for it, but there's a price tag at the end of it.
I think that, yes, I think definitely money play a very important role in the relationship between developing governments and to the Chinese government as well. But at the same time, I think there is certainly the Chinese government has been selling essentially is model of saying you could do this without giving people freedom and democracy or human rights while still being very functional. So that is something that I think in ordinary people in many countries, when they see their very dysfunctional governments, for example, in dealing with COVID, they pause a little bit and think, well, maybe the China model is pretty good.
If you look at his ability to do what he wants, really, with Uyghurs and then with Hong Kong, do you not fear what he's able to do with Taiwan?
I don't have kind of expertise with regard to military affairs, so I can't speak to certain whether or not the Chinese government's increasingly nationalistic and very kind of aggressive posturing in rhetoric and both in terms of widespread nationalism in the country would actually translate to military action across to Taiwan. I think there is a debate among kind of the China studies community about the possibility or how imminent the possibility of such talk. The reunification, quote unquote, or the forceful taking of Taiwan has been an aspiration of the Chinese government for a very long time. And this kind of escalation of rhetoric serves a domestic purpose, right? It's about shoring up support for the Chinese Communist Party.
And that's an important point, right, Maya? That you have to kind of dissect some of this. Some of it is played for nationalistic reasons, and in some cases he is speaking to the outside world and warning the outside world. And on the 100th anniversary of communism this week, you have these very bold quotes from Xi Jinping. Directed at who? China will not allow itself to be bullied, and those who try will face broken heads and bloodshed in front of the iron Great Wall of 1.4 billion Chinese people. I mean, who is bullying China?
Well, the Chinese government propagates the idea that everyone is going to bully China. The developed countries are. And that comes from, and that's not totally imaginary. China did suffer the invasion of the British army and various other countries. The Japanese invasion during the Second World War was a painful experience, and that is very well remembered until today. So they have a basis to speak about self-determination, like many countries, of course, are, and they have reasons to guard against imperialism. However, what is problematic is that this language and this history is being manipulated to conveniently erase the fact that the Chinese government itself is an aggressive, abusive power with ambitions beyond its own borders, and in addition to bullying its own people. So this language is totally along the lines of what it has said in the past, that the Chinese Communist Party is your protector. It is a domestic, it is for the domestic audience. That without us, you would not get, you would be invaded, essentially. So it's mostly a domestic message, but it's also an international one.
Do your criticisms, the reports that you write and that many other organizations have written on Tibet, on the Uyghurs, on Hong Kong, do they in any way serve to moderate the actions of the Chinese government, or do you feel that they fall on deaf ears within China?
History is a very long process, and we're talking about many people involved in the crafting of decisions in China. What we do see in the last, since 2013 of Xi Jinping, is a centralization of powers under one man, and the retreats of people who have more progressive values. What we write about are about universal human rights. It's about universal values, which I believe are received well by many people in China, and including government officials. The problem is that people who are reasonable are now very intimidated. They cannot speak on social media without fear to their lives. And so in this current environment, it would seem very hopeless. But I think that there are plenty of people who share our values, who are seeing the developments in China today with as much concern. And when the opportunity arises, and that is when repression lifts only slightly, and we have seen that in history, there will be, again, I think, a blossoming of opinion and movements and policies that could be moving the country towards a better position. But I'm not optimistic. I'm not saying that would happen. I'm just saying that this is how it works. Sometimes we are in a very difficult position, and this is the time that is very dark right now.
This is a time that's very dark now. Maya Wang from Human Rights Watch, great to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you, and have a good day.
Taiwan, meantime, has said it's prepared for war if that's what's coming. The U.S. remains a supporter of Taiwan, but is intentionally unclear on how prepared America is to engage force to come to Taiwan's defense if war looms. That's our backstory on China this week. Please share this podcast and subscribe if you haven't already. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.